Do we really understand how trade and trade agreements impact the economy, our lives, and especially the lives of small producers and workers in those tiny firms? Most discussions about trade quickly turn into ideological debates. But what are the facts on the ground? What are the ground realities? India's Foreign Minister Dr. S. Shankar has become the latest voice to express concerns that trade and trade agreements have hurt small Indian firms, that imports have flooded Indian markets, that this has created employment challenges. Many people hold the same views as Dr. Jaishankar has expressed, but these are just views. Today's episode will show that they are somewhat divorced from the facts on the ground. In a first, there are going to be two guests on the podcast today, Dr. Arvind Subramanian, former Chief Economic Advisor, Government of India, and Dr. Shoumitro Chatterjee, Assistant Professor of Economics, Pennsylvania State University. Both of them have just recently published a new research paper that is an eye-opener on this whole debate about trade. I asked them to rebut point by point all the arguments made by Dr. S. Jaishankar, suggesting that trade and trade agreements have hurt small firms and employment. Hello, Dr. Subramaniam. Hi, Shoumitro. Thank you so much for joining the Everyday Economics podcast and making time for it.
Yeah, great to be on the show. Thank you so much for having us.
Right.
Thank you, Puja. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast.
Thank you. Let me start by asking you about the ideological position on trade that seems to be dominating Indian policy right now. Well, that's one view out there is that this is an ideological position, but many people say it is a practical and a pragmatic approach, in fact, to trade. What, in your view, is Atmanirbharta? What do you make of the term Atmanirbharta and the thinking behind it?
Yeah, I think, first of all, it might be useful to just clarify some things, right? I think certainly as a kind of economist, the way we understand Atmanirbharta is, I think, certainly at least a twofold distinction. One is, and both of this, by the way, have been kind of permeating the debate for the last 3-4 years. I think one is the view that India's growth strategy should be based on domestic demand, domestic consumption, domestic investment, because the world is going to be a more unfriendly place, and therefore we should become self-reliant as a growth and development strategy. A related, but I think nevertheless distinct dimension of Atmanirbharta is the whole trade side, i.e., should we be, kind of partly pursuing this strategy through policies that, raise tariff barriers, keep out foreign competition, favor domestic industry, domestic production, and so on. So they're both of a piece, a kind of macro strategy that says domestic demand and a trade strategy that says protectionism and import substitution is the way forward. So that's, I think, kind of what we make of Atmanirbharta. Why is it happening? I think, to be fair, India is not the only country that's being, quote unquote, afflicted by this sentiment. It's happening around the world, whether it's, Trump saying "Make America Great Again," or whether it's China saying, we're going to have a strategy based on, domestic technology, domestic firms, and so on. So it's happening worldwide, and there's, globalization has gone out of favor. And of course, also the backlash against neoliberalism more broadly. So I think the intellectual zeitgeist internationally is also moving in that direction. But I think there is a peculiarly Indian overlay to this, which I think Shoumitro and I deal with our paper. I think there are 2 or 3 things, very important things underlying this. One, I think this is where it's a little bit sad. It's almost like we don't look at our own history. We think that growth has been and should be based on domestic demand. And that just flies in the face of the evidence that we've put together, which is kind of, for us, the wow moment in this research, which is that you find that, India's export growth has been stellar, not just in services, but in manufacturing as well. So the first cause, I think, is based on a myth that India's past and India's future will be domestic demand based, and that's not true. I think the second reason it's happening, and I think this is really a very, very kind of deep kind of sentiment that's taken over India, is this, it's kind of based on the success of the past. We think now we're such a big market. The Prime Minister keeps talking about demand, demography, the whole sense that, we're a big market. Therefore, we can, it's not so costly to overlook the foreign market because we have a big market. We can sustain import substitution. And I think the third reason is probably that, again, the notion that the world is going to be less friendly towards exports. So, why embark on a strategy that's bound to run up against barriers internationally? That's another point. The last point is a bit more controversial, is not in the paper itself. I mean, I do think that if you look at the BJP more broadly, it was always a party that was kind of afflicted or conflicted, as it were. There was a kind of pro-business, pro-market kind of section to that, which, of course, in an era of neoliberalism was given expression. But I think they always also had this, nativist agenda, lots of elements in the BJP. So I think there was a kind of tussle, and maybe, one part of it is now reasserting itself, building on all the other things that I've just mentioned.
Yeah, I think people without background in economics find it difficult to comprehend that, first of all, there can be no domestic competitiveness unless you have global competitiveness. It's a bit like I keep saying that, if your cricket team is only going to play Ranji trophies, Ranji cricket, it's not going to become a world-beating cricket team. You have to play international cricket to be a good cricket team. You can't become a good international cricket team playing only domestic cricket. And similarly, international trade makes the economy more competitive. It's like you're saying, difficult to grow at a higher rate substantially without higher exports. One point that stands out, and it stands out because of the person who has said this, is Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar, who has blamed trade for the hardships that small manufacturers have faced in India over the last few years. And I think he talks about the last decade and a half or so. Whereas, I think people have not understood his speech well. It's he does make he seems to make a nuanced point when he says that there's no going back on trade and globalization. Of course, trade and globalization have led to good growth for India. But he says that, it has not been good for small manufacturers. And he has linked this, he's linked this distress in small manufacturers to trade, and in particular trade with RCEP countries. I'm going to, through this conversation, break down the arguments that he and others like him have made and get you to respond to each of these points, because these are many points. But to begin with, if you could begin by saying what is the role that trade has played in India's growth and employment record? Is Dr. Jaishankar factually correct? And is it fair for him to say that openness to trade has hurt the economy because it has hurt small industry? I will ask you separately about, trade agreements and RCEP. Right now, only to talk about trade.
So Arvind touched on it very briefly in his sort of opening remarks, but it will be good to lay down some of the numbers, right? So, I mean, our own experience post 91 has been that India has almost been an East Asian tiger in terms of both export growth and the contribution of trade to economic growth, right? And although, and this was the wow moment that Arvind was talking about. I mean, we like to think of India as this exporter of mostly services, software, etc. But when we looked at the data, the following was just staggering. So the growth of the average annual growth of manufacturing exports has been 12% year on year for almost a 30-year period, starting in the 90s, right? And India was bettered in only by China and Vietnam. So India was in terms of export growth. Therefore, India was a major trade powerhouse in the world, and this definitely had impact on our economic growth. So if you look at the period after 91, for each of the decades, the contribution of exports to kind of the exogenous demand components has at least been 1/3. In some decades, slightly more. So I feel it would be slightly unfair to say that trade has kind of quote unquote hurt the general economy. And then there are of course spillovers, right? So if the economy does well in certain sectors, you also generate sort of jobs and employment in other sectors.
But can I say, I think that one has to be, I think, take this question on a little bit more, I think, squarely and honestly, because I think we are, when we keep saying trade, we say exports. But I guess what Jay would say is, you only talk about exports, but what about imports? That's the culprit. So remember, deep down, I think everyone thinks that exports are good and imports are bad, because if you say, the idea is that, you import 1 unit more, therefore you produce 1 unit less. So that's kind of the mental model I think we have to address, I think, here. Is that fair? I think we should take that on head on, I think.
Yeah. So I think just sorry to sort of stress what you're saying. I think what has happened is that India signed a series of free trade agreements that came into the force in the 2000s, and across industry and policymakers, views emerged that these FTAs have not served India well, and they have actively damaged Indian industry. I think the words that Dr. Jaishankar has used is that imported products have flooded Indian markets. So the question becomes then is that have India's FTA partners dumped their products in Indian markets? Is this a correct view that the FTAs have not served India well? And I must mention here that former CI President Naushad Forbes, has said that India's FTAs have not had an adverse impact on Indian industry. But is that borne out by your analysis as well?
Yeah. So firstly, I think we need to address the broader question that, in all this, the notion is that imports are bad and, that's creating the problems. So it's first of all worth, emphasizing is the period when we saw the rapid export growth is, coincides also with the period of rapid import growth. So in a sense, when we talk about trade being good for India's overall growth, it's both because exports grew and because imports also grew alongside. I think you can't disentangle the two. So that's kind of point number one. Point number two, when you come to the FTAs themselves, first of all, remember that India probably, India's biggest import partner is China, not the FTA countries, and probably the United States. So even if you looked at overall import coming into India and import growth, our trade from the FTA countries is probably a small fraction of overall imports. So one, imports overall are good for the economy for exports. B, even if you didn't buy that, imports from non-FTA countries are huge, and imports from FTA countries are relatively small. Third, how much of the imports from FTA countries are due to the FTAs themselves, as opposed to just, you grow rapidly, you're going to import more from everyone, including FTA countries. And here, what you have to keep in mind that India's FTAs are generally fairly weak FTAs. There are lots of exemptions. The time horizons are stretched out. So if you ask around the world about, what do you think of India's FTAs? The term that's used for India's FTAs is Swiss cheese FTAs, i.e. full of holes, delayed and kind of basically, this is one thing where India has managed to be kind of half pregnant when it comes to, its FTAs. So the notion, therefore, that, oh my God, so, it's because of imports due to FTAs from FTA countries have destroyed Indian industry. Just the numbers don't stack up on the, given all that I've, spelled out. Now, it's possible that, in selected sectors, the famous palm oil from whatever Malaysia, it's possible that, in some sectors there have been disproportionate impacts. But, that's what trade agreements do. I mean, and finally, what I would say is that, even if that happens, we always have policy instruments at our disposal, like, safeguards, anti-dumping, countervailing, to kind of soften or cushion the impact of these, these surges from particular countries in particular products. So I think the whole FTA thing is just, India is just blown completely out of proportion to what I think the actual impact has been. In some ways, you sign an FTA in order to be able to import more from all these countries, and I think the evidence is probably small on that.
So are you saying that Dr. Jaishankar and people who make the same argument that he make are confusing import sensitivity of exports with import dependence? The words he used is import dependence, but people seem to think that what he's trying to say is that, we are importing stuff because we are not able to make it because exports are making us not sort of taking away our ability to manufacture those products. So that's an incorrect view. We are importing those products because we are able to value add to them and further export. Is that the point you're making?
See, firstly, what I've tried to say is also, please, let's look at the numbers, okay? Because if Jaishankar's argument is that imports because of FTAs is causing all this hardship, right? And what I want
to say, but we don't have an
is,
FTA with China, which is where we are importing everything.
Yeah, exactly, and we're importing a lot from Europe, we're importing a lot. So imports are driven by lots of things, and FTAs are one component of that. And FTAs with these ASEAN countries are an even smaller component of that. And imports from these, due to the liberalization under these agreements, are an even smaller fraction of that. So I think just the magnitudes are completely overplayed. But now your question now about what we import, I suspect, we import from these countries some inputs for exports. We import some which we consume, like, maybe cheaper electronics, toys from some of these countries. I think that is just a benefit of a freer trade for consumers. And I suspect part of the problem is that maybe people think that these FTAs have become a way for China to circumvent, the tariffs that are being imposed or the barriers against regular Chinese goods. And if that is the case, that's, I think, a legitimate case where I think maybe we need to take more action against that. But bottom line is that, just the numbers don't at all, add up to the kind of hill of beans that is being made out.
So let's talk about China. India has had a large trade deficit with China, like you're saying, without even having an FTA. Mm-hmm. Is Indian industry's fear of Chinese imports genuine? And I want to also, get your view on another argument which many people make, and I think TCS Srinivasa Raghavan makes it the best when he says that, China makes a mockery of standard trade theory. How can anybody have comparative advantage against China, given their economic model is characterized by very intensive state capitalism, which in fact the US now calls party capitalism? So China, do you also see China as a problem in trade?
Okay. Look, I think that firstly, the background to this is that India not only runs high and rising trade deficits with China, there's also, I think, a problem in terms of the pattern of trade. I think, we, Shoumitro and I have calculated that, we predominantly export raw materials and we predominantly import, finished goods and manufactured goods. So I think that is the backdrop to understanding our, trade relationship with China. and of course, just to an aside, the notion that idols of Ganeshas, this great Indian civilization, these idols have to be imported from China. I think rankles the Indian imagination, maybe with some justification. So I think that's the context. Second, therefore, I think Indian industry is, I think, fearful based on the past record. As an economist, one shouldn't give too much weight to bilateral trade deficits, but in the real world, these things do matter. Point number two, I think this is not just TCA saying, but the world over saying, and I think I have a lot of sympathy for that view, is that China is an unusual trader, and it's a trader that deploys all kinds of policy instruments, some legitimate, but also a lot of this not so legitimate, to boost its exports. We saw famously in the 2000s, mid 2000s, Chinese currency policy was egregiously manipulated.
Yes.
We also have seen China subsidizing, providing subsidies through, its banks, through its state-owned enterprises. I think that's also, a legitimate thing. And also, I don't know whether you recall a recent history when Rahul Khullar was the Commerce Secretary in India. I think he used to complain that Indian products being exported to China could also be kind of easily kept out through non-tariff barriers and other means. So the notion that trade with China is not a level playing field, given China's past behavior, is something that we have to be utterly sensitive to. And of course, if the rest of the world has not been able to stop China from indulging in these practices, what chance do we have or RCEP partners have? I mean, it is a bit odd, isn't it, that at a time when China makes a big hullabaloo and joins RCEP, it has imposed draconian restrictions on Australian exports to China, which is part of RCEP. Yes. Which is part of RCEP too. So I think that the fact that China is a kind of quasi, I have to be careful with my words, but that it deploys a lot of things which do not lead to a level playing field is something that I think we have to take very seriously.
So, so what would you recommend to negotiators, Indian negotiators who have so far kept out of, India has almost withdrawn from RCEP? And, while the RCEP members have left the door open, India doesn't seem inclined to join even at a later date. And the official position, of course, is that joining RCEP will have negative consequences for the economy for the reasons that we have discussed. But there's also a counter view, which is that, and which is, I think, worth debating, which is that India might be taking a bigger risk by staying out of the world's largest and perhaps most dynamic trading bloc. Would staying out of RCEP put Indian manufacturing exports at risk of losing market share to other RCEP countries? And this becomes more important when we talk about global value chains.
Yeah. So Shoumitro, please, you have to come in. Let me just say two things, and you please come in. See, I think let's take the second question first. Yeah, I think having said all that we've said, that there are problems vis-a-vis China, I think we should also be realistic and honest in saying that staying out will have costs for India, right? These are the costs of getting cheap inputs, cheap products, the familiar gains from trade, but also losing or being discriminated in our being able to export into these markets. Now, why that is especially costly at this juncture is the thing that Shoumitro and I kind of wrote about. See, if you step back, but after the global financial crisis, China was becoming richer and becoming uncompetitive in a whole range of labor-intensive goods. So that was the first opportunity for India and other countries to say, okay, we are going to fill and occupy the space vacated by China. And Shoumitro and I have calculated that, in that period, China vacated space of about $140 billion or so, and India occupied very little of that. So that first opportunity, India just forewent. Then came the second opportunity with all these which where we are today, these geopolitical tensions, there's a second kind of exit from China. Now, when those investors are looking at alternative destinations, and India is kind of offering itself up as one, India becomes a less attractive destination in this current context if the most dynamic market, ASEAN, China, is going to be more difficult to penetrate. So I think that is the particular conjunctural cost of staying out of RCEP in this moment in time. And it's a little bit, on the one hand, we're trying to offer all these incentives to all these countries, which I think we can discuss. But on the other hand, if they're going to be discriminated against in terms of selling back into this market, I think RCEP imposes some serious costs. So I think it is a cost-benefit calculation that we have to do. That's point one. But point two, I think one way of, if Jaishankar is, if he's right and he says, we haven't turned back from globalization, I think one way to respond to this would be to say, look, we've not turned away from globalization. We recognize that RCEP, is tricky for us for all the reasons we've discussed. Why don't we negotiate agreements with, say, blocks like the European Union, where in fact there's greater complementarity and less competition? So take, for example, this other piece of research that Shoumitro and I showed that, we are under exporting labor-intensive goods by something between $60 to $150 billion every year. That's kind of the lost India's missing exports. Now, the EU imposes tariffs on these labor-intensive products on us, but not on our competitors, Bangladesh and Vietnam, who have a leg up in the European market in these very important labor-intensive goods. So why don't we say, look, this is the opportunity for us. This is where we are underperforming. This is our also way of signaling we're not against globalization, and therefore be really serious about negotiating a free trade agreement with the European Union, which then, it will have a kind of China dimension on the strategic side. It will level the playing field and give a boost to our labor-intensive exports that we sorely need. And it will also signal that, our turning away from RCEP is for strategic other reasons, not because we're turning inward. I think that is probably the way forward.
And Shoumitro, if you want to come in on what Dr. Subramanian said, but also, again, both of you, so what would your recommendations be for future trade agreements, and negotiations, especially RCEP going forward, given these points that you've made?
Yeah, so just kind of to build on what Arvind was already saying, I guess, we started the conversation by saying that, look, India is this sort of major exporting force in the world. But I think really the one sort of detail that we kind of missed there was to also say that our composition of exports is really very unique, right? And if you kind of go back to the first generation of trade theories where you gain from specialization, all those theories basically said that you specialize in sectors where you have a comparative advantage in. And in an economy like India's, where you have a lot of labor force, you would have thought that India would specialize in low-skill manufacturing products. But as Arvind was saying, when you look at the data, that is precisely the sector where we haven't done as well. So compared to our labor endowment, we are not exporting as much of low-skill manufacturing products, so things like apparel, textile, leather, and footwear. And then you have to ask the question, why is this happening? One of the reasons is that the current system of trade and exports is one where you have global value chains, and it is true. It is kind of hard to digest, but this is an important point, which is that in order to export more, you have to import more. So that if in order to become globally competitive in, let's say, textiles, our manufacturer should be able to import the best inputs at the lowest possible prices. But if you look at the tariffs on let's say, man-made yarn, which is a key input for textiles, amongst all our competitors, it is the highest. And that hurts our exports. On top of it, sort of not having a trade agreement with the European Union hurts on the output side, because there we have to compete with Bangladesh, whose exports of textiles attract no tariffs. So kind of strategically thinking about where we want to integrate more, that helps our exports is important.
So I think, but let's turn to the specific question that you asked. What should we do on trade agreements? I think in some ways, I would say that's putting the cart before the horse. And let me explain why. I'm not ducking the question. I'll come to what we should do on RCEP or whatever in just a moment. You see, there's a big contrast between a country like India and even countries like China and Mexico. What is really interesting about China was that it used its accession into the WTO, which was, taking on external disciplines as a way of facilitating domestic reform. I mean, people may not remember that when Zhu Rongji took China into the WTO in 2001, he actually wanted to reform the state-owned enterprises sector. He was having difficulty doing it domestically. He said, let's join the WTO. That will put in turn pressure. So using external discipline for furthering domestic reform is something that other countries have done, but India has never done that. In India's external policy has been driven and determined by domestic policy and domestic politics. So, which leads me to the specific answer to your question is, what should we do about trade agreements is kind of asking the reverse question, because unless we, are willing to open up domestically, it's not easy to, sign free trade agreements. I mean, no matter what the costs and benefits, if we're going to raise tariffs, as we've done, as Shoumitro and I've shown, by in a kind of repudiation of 30 years of policy, we raise tariffs enormously, affecting 70% of our imports by about 5 percentage points. How can you integrate internationally, whatever the agreement, if you're going to raise tariffs domestically? So I think that we have to come to a more like an internal consensus that we need to open up, and then that can pave the way for joining the EU, or considering joining RCEP at a later stage. So do the domestic, take action on, or at least revise the consensus, the turning inward consensus that we've seemed to have converged on. And then think about, different agreements like the European Union, where we have much more complementarities of interest.
And I think, sort of understanding what exactly has slowed exports in recent years, what has held back exports from growing to full potential, because I think everybody agrees, including Dr. Jaishankar, that exports have not grown to full potential. Understanding the various factors that have gone into this will probably help people have greater faith in trade. One of the reasons people do not have faith in trade is because they seem to believe that everything that's going wrong with both exports and manufacturing GDP growth slowing down, they think that the only reason for that is competition from Chinese imports or imports from other countries.
That, I think, is a very, very important question, and I think it's kind of the central part of the research that we did. So if we look at the period after the global financial crisis, a major reason of sort of slowdown of Indian exports was just the fact that after the global financial crisis, the world exports had collapsed. But even if you look in that period, the growth rate of Indian exports was outpaced the growth rate of world exports by about 2 to 3 percentage points. So even in the sort of post-global financial crisis period, when the world exports had collapsed, India was actually doing better than the world. But you were not doing as well just because the world had collapsed. So So that is one thing sort of to be sort of very careful about.
Yeah.
The second part of the question, which is what has held back exports from growing to full potential, I think there are to my mind, there are two parts to that answer. So one is the peculiar form of specialization that has happened in India, right? So our exports were mostly kind of high skill manufacturing products like pharmaceuticals, auto parts, and services. And we did not really take advantage of the comparative advantage sector, which would be low skill manufacturing. That would be one, and the second would be the kind of the exchange rate policy, which also hit our export competitiveness.
So I think the point you make about labor-intensive exports not doing as well as the rest of the export basket is very important, because that's where the employment argument of Dr. Jaishankar is coming from. He blames trade for the employment challenge because he can see that labor-intensive exports have not done well. But like you have shown in your paper, India has had this opportunity, in fact, with China vacating that space, and India has not taken advantage of it. And the reasons are probably domestic policy errors rather than anything to do with trade.
Yeah,
both we think. I think.
Go ahead, Shoumitro. Go ahead.
So both we think. I think one sort of maybe a domestic policy, but also not being as integrated in the global value chain. So if you look at for example, the foreign content of textile exports in China and Vietnam, it's about 45%. So they are able to kind of source the best inputs and have their exports be very competitive at the world stage. Whereas for India, that's only about 15%. And part of it has to do with the high tariffs that we put on inputs. Sorry, Arvind, you were saying?
See, I think just stepping back a little bit, because it's a really important thing to understand, right? Firstly, one of the striking things about our research is that for 25, 30 years, our exports and manufacturing did very well. And, of course, mostly low skill didn't do as well as high skill, but, we were able to compete on exports in some sectors for a long time. So there should be no inherent nervousness about our ability to export or compete, because we've done that very successfully, of course, in services, but also in high skill manufacturing. That's point one. The point about the low skill manufacturing, I think we need to be clear, is that this is a long standing problem. It's not that, it's happened in the last 3 years or 4 years. This missing exports a finding of ours is due to, you probably have to go back to the industrial policy resolution to, all the impediments over the years we've put to becoming big, the way we've penalized manufacturing in all kinds of ways that have led to this. So I don't think we should, glibly say that, this is a recent problem, or it's a complicated, long-standing problem, and it has been intrinsic to India's basic development model itself. So it is an indictment of 50 years of past performance. The question is whether we can remedy that going forward, and if so, how. I think that's the key point, on the labor skill imports. I think in principle, we could remedy that. And I think your point that so many things domestically have to be done right, whether it's the ease of doing business, whether are we still, land acquisition, are we still placing impediments on firms becoming big, should there be more center-state cooperation, in making available inputs in a way that, makes business attractive to do in India? Should we have more competitive exchange rate policies that we require? I think that's one set of issues. And then on the external...
And credit availability.
And credit. And then on the...
And barriers to exit.
Yeah. Exactly, barriers to exit. So it's like almost all of industrial policy. But a key component of that also is, does that require more integration or less integration? You can't duck that problem. And what Shoumitro has been saying is that in labor intensive goods, there's no getting away from, getting cheap inputs. You take apparel, which is, I think, everyone's favorite example. Man-made fibers are the fastest growing segment in the world. Uh, Man-made fibers means you need cheap inputs of man-made fibers. By the way, if you look at our paper, Vietnam, in order to export apparel, it imports 45%. For every $1 of exports, $45 are imported. China in the late 90s, similar ratio. If you look at our numbers, for every $1 of export, we import 15 or 16 cents. So you can't become competitive. And if you have tariffs on yarn, which are way above competitors in Bangladesh, Vietnam, I think now our man-made fiber tariff is something like 20, correct me if I'm wrong, Shoumitro, 20 or 25%, and we raised it
20%.
in 20. So I think there's no ducking that, if you want to do labor-intensive exports, domestic policy, but on external policy, it requires more, not less integration.
I think the point you're making, is not very easy for non-economists to understand. And I felt this myself. I was having a conversation with somebody who's a buyer, for large houses, retail houses in Europe. And this person said, as an Indian, you'll never understand what I'm saying, because Indians mostly wear cotton or, natural fibers. But in the rest of the world, we don't wear cotton. We wear man-made synthetic fibers. And, if India has to produce those kind of garments and apparel, you have to be able to use those fabrics. But Indian people don't understand this argument, because you think about what is most commonly available in your country, which is cotton. But that's no good for the export market.
But I think Indian exporters are fully aware of that. I think you're right about the domestic consumer still thinking, But Indian exporters, when I don't want to say this, but when I was in government, we did enact this package for clothing, right? And
yes,
the thrust of that package was, of course, can we reduce the burden on apparel exports? But that should have been or was meant to be part of a broader strategy where we, also reduce tariffs on yarn, where we entered into free trade agreements so that our access in exports could improve. So I think we need to go back to that.
It's a lot of things. He was saying, for instance, that, if you have to, he gave an example. He said, for instance, we have to make a certain T-shirt, which is going to be sold in a particular merchandise. It'll have a particular design, which must have a certain dye, which is only available in 1 or 2 countries of the world. You have to be able to import it. It must arrive in time. Otherwise, you lose the contract to a competitor. You must have trade policy that allows you to import that chemical dye and a whole lot of other things. It's very complex, but all these arguments that people make on trade, they completely lose sight of all these things.
See, I think that one way, this supply chain, I think is another word that kind of phases people. I think the way to understand this is actually very simple. Is to building on what you just said, is that supply chain is nothing but goods have to just zigzagging within an outside border. So if you want to produce something that will require, say, 50 transactions, and say 40 of those transactions will involve goods going abroad and coming back in some form or the other, or some input coming in. So if things have to come in much more often than they used to, that means that coming in must be easy. Means low tariffs,
imports.
Low imports, low tariffs, and the ease of importing and trading should also come down. So that's what a value chain is. This zigzagging back and forth across borders to produce the most efficient product, and that's what I think. That's one way of thinking about value chains.
So just to sort of give one example and add to what Arvind just said, there's a very beautiful figure in the last World Development Report of a bicycle. I mean, you tend to think that China is producing all these cell phones, etc. And you would imagine that if they're producing a bicycle, they would probably be producing like all components of the bicycle. But what this chart in the World Development Report showed, that even for something which is sort of not as sophisticated, but is a bicycle, the saddle comes from Spain, the brakes come from Japan, and then a lot of the metal and the final assembly is done in China. And that's the reality of our sort of production supply chains these days, and that is what makes it cheaper for consumers to consume. And to just go back to your point about sort of consumers, I think Indian consumers, whenever they have gotten the opportunity and have gotten the variety, they've always chosen the best, right? Because otherwise, to go back to our initial conversation, why would they buy Ganesha idols being produced in China? There is a efficiency advantage that they are taking benefit of.
I want to come back to. I want to make it a little bit controversial now in just a second, but I want to come back to your cricket analogy that you made, right? And I'm going to tie it to what the controversial point I'm going to make. That, as you rightly said, that if you play Ranji Trophy cricket alone, when you go and play World Cup or Test matches, so to be good at Test matches, you have to play Test matches. But there's also a reverse thing, that if you are good at world-class Test cricket, the quality of T20 and one day also improves. So there's also so if you're competitive internationally, your domestic consumers will also benefit quite a bit. So there's a kind of double asymmetry which people don't realize, that you have to compete in order to be able to compete internationally. But if you compete internationally, your domestic consumers will also benefit through higher efficiency and better cost of production. Which leads me to, I don't want to let Jaishankar off the hook, because that speech also says that India is a big market, consumption is very important. That's why I wanted to make the distinction that I did, that the other dimension of this is this whole notion that we can sustain long run growth based on a domestic market and domestic consumption. And I think that has seeped in very deep into Indian consciousness, Indian policymakers, that so what, 1.3 billion consumers, 500 geo users, 700 million, whatever. And these numbers lull us into thinking that somehow, this big market can sustain, 8 to 10% growth for 20 years. I mean, as we show in our paper, it's a complete delusion to think that we are, quote unquote, we're not a small market, but when by no means the big market that we think we are. So that we have no choice but to think of the world as the potential market, and so I think that consciousness has to seep in, that we are not big. And moreover, the history of development shows, and this is that no country in the post-war period has generated 8-10% overall growth without export growth in double digits. So the notion that you can build this on domestic market is a complete fantasy.
In fact, I'm a little surprised and taken aback by this argument, especially being made by him, because if you go back and read the Prime Minister's first Independence Day speech in 2014, August, when he talked about Make in India for the first time, his whole argument was that I'm laying out the red carpet. I'm going to lay out the red carpet for foreign investors to come and set up manufacturing industry in India and employ local Indians. That will help them earn incomes and generate purchasing power. And that is going to be the market. It's not like there is a market already ready for the taking. I think that this new speech by Dr. Jaishankar seems to in some way contradict a little that thinking, that economic thinking.
I see. I think, remember that, these are all kind of principles that are expostulated, and then how you actually interpret and implement those kind of change over time. I think Make in India always had this, tension between whether it actually meant becoming internationally competitive, or whether it meant import substitution. There was a kind of a kind of almost a deliberate ambiguity about that phrase. But it has gotten clarified over time, including in Jaishankar's speech, that it is a lot about Indian market, import substitution, and so on. But I do think that something that I've become like a stuck record on this. I do think the notion has crept in based on past success that somehow we're a very big economy and therefore we can sustain growth based on that. And I think that is a myth that needs to be completely dispelled.
And one of the arguments they make is, sorry, yeah.
Sorry, just to add to that, I think the other distinction that we should also make, which Arvind should also clarify, is that even the sort of initial Make in India thing, there is a difference between kind of the mercantile view of things and the trade view of things. I mean, even I guess in the initial speeches when you wanted to set up industry in India, I don't think the thinking was that we are going to import more, set up industry, and then export more. You always just wanted to set up industry and just export without having to import more. And I think that distinction is going.
And just to add one more argument for you to clarify on, which is that people who support import substitution now say that it's necessary in the present circumstances, and the experience this time will be different from the 1970s because there are no small industry reservations or the kind of rules about firm size, business volumes, etc., that existed back then. What would you say to people who are offering these kind of arguments?
Yeah, so I think, but first, just to clarify that the argument, I think the kind of reasonable, intelligent argument for the case today would be something along the following lines, that we're doing import substitution today. One, it's very different from the past, A, because the tariffs are not as high, one. B, we don't have all these small-scale reservations, etc. So this time will be different. One. But however, it has to come with the idea that import substitution is going to be a means to an export promotion strategy, i.e., you can't be import substitution for import substitution's sake, because as we just said, the Indian market cannot on its own generate 8% growth. So it has to be import substitution, whatever, as a way of getting back into becoming competitive and so on. So the question really is, what confidence do we have today that even though we're providing protection, we're granting subsidies, what is the guarantee today that firms will become competitive, wean themselves off these benefits that the government is doing, and truly become globally competitive? And I think, to be fair, I think we should be open to the possibility that might happen, but I think that because the East Asians in the 60s and 70s and 80s did do a version of that, to be fair. They said, we'll give you cheap credit, we'll give you some protection, whatever, but we do all this only if you can show us that you're internationally competitive. So the discipline of exporting was the stick that governments wielded over industry for all the benefits that government provided. So it was sophisticated industrial policy, but with this credible discipline. The question is, can we, somehow manufacture that credible discipline today? So, for example, you give production-linked incentives. Can we make sure that actually they lead to efficient production, they lead to exports? And, Shankar Acharya had a very nice piece in Business Standard a few days ago, where he expressed kind of anxiety about, whether, this could really happen or not, because our experience shows that it's more likely that it will proliferate into a subsidy tariff raj, that, the procedures are going to remain as cumbersome as before. There's going to be, rent seeking, there's going to be corruption. So I think the onus of proof is on those who say this time will be different to, in fact, show why, what are the credible mechanisms in place on the part of the government to show that the discipline of export performance will be the yardstick by which any of this will be justified, will be continued, will be maintained.
And I thought the most important point. Sorry, yeah, please, Shoumitro.
No, just adding to that, and to just talk specifically about the PLI schemes in cell phones, which in the data, if you just look at the production of sort of cell phone parts and even export, it seems to be taking up. But of course, if you look at the data on the input side, right? So the stated policy to begin with was to remove some of these subsidies gradually. But I think twice it has already happened that they did not remove the subsidies and continued with it. So all this just saying that it's hard. It's not easy to prove that you will be globally competitive.
And I thought, a very good point that Dr. Shankaracharya made in that piece that we are discussing is that, the bureaucracy is the same. How do we assume that the bureaucracy is going to, suddenly have some greater insights into which particular product should be given subsidy and which should not? And how can they know better than the market? Not every product out there is a cell phone. That cell phone is probably the largest market right now for manufactured products, and a service also it is.
And also remember with industrial policies, it's not just about what Shankar and you are saying are absolutely right. How do you change procedures, picking winners? But on the other side, if there are failures, how do we exit out of failures? That's been a tombstone of industrial policy in the past as well. So it's not just picking winners, but letting losers die. And if anything, our financial sector problem shows that we are just unable to crack the problem of exit. If you can't get exit in the financial system, is it going to be easy that, supposing we give subsidies to some things and we find that, this is not the right product to promote, is it going to be easy to get out of that? I think that also is a question we need to think about.
Political mine, absolutely. Towards the end of this conversation, I just wanted to get you to say, to talk about how probably importance of trade for India has probably just increased in the post-COVID world, where China also plans to focus on its domestic market. And, President Trump has lost the US presidential election, and the Indian government's balance sheet, the Indian household sector's balance sheet, and the Indian financial sector, like you were just saying, none of these segments in the Indian setup has the firepower to sort of power growth, power the recovery. So trade is even more important than it would be otherwise.
Yeah. So in a sense, it's a bit ironic, right? That there are people who say, domestic consumption, domestic investment should be a long-term strategy. And, I think that flies a little bit in the face of the evidence that Shoumitro and I provided. But in the current conjuncture, it's almost as if, we have no option but to export, because if you look at the three big components of, domestic demand, whether it's, consumption, investment, or government spending, for example, government spending, we know that post-COVID, debt and deficits are going to be so high that, any kind of, even a semblance of prudence and caution will dictate that, our space there is going to be limited. So government powering us back into growth is kind of limited. Investment, as we know, unless we fix the financial system, it's going to be very difficult to get credit. As we know, real credit to industry has been, low and negative for many, many years now. And, so financing investment is going to be difficult. And household balance sheet are also short because incomes have collapsed, employment has collapsed. So, to expect, these balance sheets, which are really impaired to power domestic demand, is kind of exactly the opposite. So in a sense, we have no choice but to turn to, because at least with exporting, some of these constraints are going to be, it's just a matter of becoming, competitive. And then, of course, you have the markets, you'll probably have the financing, trade financing will be easier. Exporters generally have easier access to financing. So in many ways, I think the export channel is almost the only channel we have, only feasible channel we have in the short run, because of the state of all the balance sheets that are propping up, consumption, investment, and the government. So it is a bit, almost like no choice but to do this strategy.
Shoumitro, you want to add to that?
Just to add to that, I mean, it is also true that we feel that there are several reasons why there will be opportunities in the future, right? So one, if you start by just looking at the macro data, it is true that kind of post-COVID, there has been a little bit of slowdown in globalization, but that is true only for good. So if you look at trade and services, that has actually increased post-COVID, and especially sort of post-COVID in things that do not require that do not require sort of personal contact. Services, that is something that kind of India was sort of doing well pre-COVID, and that is something we can take advantage of even in the future. The second thing is, although there is a slowdown in trade of goods, for India to do well, it doesn't have to do like too much in terms of testing kind of the global system. And that is because as we stand today, we occupy a very small fraction of the global market, right? So, I mean, in terms of the global sort of merchandise market, in India's global market share is only about 1.7%, which is slightly lower than Vietnam's. So we calculated this, that even if you wanted kind of a respectable export growth over the next a decade or so, because you have it's kind of the benefit of not doing well in the past. Because you have such a small share of the global market, you can still have a healthy export growth and not test the global system too much. And the third thing is that even for sort of the trade and goods, there is a limit to deglobalization, I feel, in the post-COVID world. One, because all there have been a lot of sort of fixed costs and sunk costs of setting up these global value chains, and it will not be easy, even if everybody wanted to. And I don't think everybody is wanting to do this. Even if they wanted to, it's not easy to go back and bring back all the, let's say, reshore all your production activities. And the second thing is that if you try to do everything domestically, that will, in sort of a Krugman sense, raise domestic prices. And to the extent that that is a natural limit to deglobalization, we feel that there will be opportunities for India in the future.
Dr. Subramanian, before I let you go, the last thing I want to ask you is, you've been in government, and there is a view I hear all the time, especially from people who have worked in the Department of Economic Affairs and Commerce, where they say that for the last many years, the roles played by these two departments in trade negotiations and formulation of trade strategy and growth strategy has reduced, and economic diplomacy is becoming increasingly just about Ministry of External Affairs. Is this sort of turf segregation also responsible for the kind of positions that India has been taking on some of these trade-related matters?
I know this is an argument that's made a lot, that the siloization or maybe the some departments having inadequate role. Not my own view is that there is enough coordination and aggregation happening at the level of the Prime Minister's office and various kinds of groups chaired at a very senior level, where all these kinds of groups, these different opinions, get a really decent shot at expressing their views. So the notion that some people's voices are not heard or prevented from being heard because of some institutional barriers, I find that less credible, because we have enough aggregation coordination mechanisms. I think finally, the choices that are made, I think, are made based on very conscious assessment of different points of view. So in that sense, to point the finger at kind of the institutional dimension and institutional siloization is almost letting the policymakers off the hook for the choices that they make. I think there's, as a general principle, you want more expertise, of course, as a general principle. But I don't think in the trade arena these choices are being made because somehow people don't understand many of these things. I think that's
they're conscious choices. You're saying?
Yeah, I think they are pretty conscious choices that are being made, and it's true that some evidence, some expertise, to highlight some things which were not known, always kind of help, and so I don't want to at all minimize the role that talent and expertise should and can and have played. But I think at the end of the day, we're not raising tariffs because we somehow don't understand, what the consequences will be. We're not joining RCEP because we don't understand what the consequences will be.
Right. Thank you so much. Thank you for speaking with me, Dr. Subramanian and Shoumitro.
Thanks a lot for having us on the program.
Thank you.